Welcome to Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson. Thanks for joining us today. Our topic is diabetes, and my guest is award-winning journalist and best-selling author Gary Taubes, whose new book is called Rethinking Diabetes: What Science Reveals About Diet, Insulin, and Successful Treatments. Gary, great to see you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Lori.
So you've written a number of hugely, wildly successful books, and this one you've chosen to focus in on the issue of diabetes. Talk about how many Americans have diabetes and how that number has changed over the years.
Well, that's the key, is not just the total number, but the increase. 70 years ago, maybe 2 million Americans were diagnosed with diabetes. Today, the number is 29 to 30 million. And another 8 to 9 million who are undiagnosed. So 1 in 9 Americans, in effect, are living with this disease, whether they know it or not.
How concerned are you about that increase? I mean, what is your response as a health expert to that incredible rise?
I'm tremendously concerned. I'm a little more concerned that other people don't care as much as I do. The cost to society of this disease is estimated by the American Diabetes Association is over $400 billion a year. That's over $1 billion a day. Direct medical care costs are $300 billion a year. 1 in every 4 healthcare dollars is spent on diabetes or its chronic complications. The word epidemic has been overplayed over the past decade, but we have seen epidemic increases in the prevalence of this disorder. It's a burden to everyone who has it and their family members. It is likely to bankrupt our healthcare system.
And, you know, we're talking about predominantly type 2 diabetes, but also what about pre-diabetes? Aren't there also millions of people who are about to become diabetic?
Yeah, well, so we have type 2 diabetes, which constitutes 90 to 95% of all diagnoses, and then type 1 diabetes, which is the more severe acute form that used to be considered a child onset disorder. If you throw in prediabetes, then more than half of all Americans are at risk. So the numbers worldwide have increased fourfold, according to the World Health Organization, from 1980 to 2015 or so. The number of people diagnosed with diabetes increased from 100 million to over 400 million. And the director of the World Health Organization, 2017, gave a famous lecture in Bethesda, Maryland, where she said this is a slow motion disaster. And we're watching it happen in real time. And she gave an estimate, a prediction of how likely it was that health agencies like her own would be able to rein this epidemic in, to slow the rise. And her prediction was that there was essentially zero possibility that would happen.
Are certain people, certain segments of the population more susceptible to developing type 2 diabetes?
Well, it associates with age and with weight. So as we get older and as we get heavier, it's more prevalent in lower socioeconomic groups. It's more prevalent in the uneducated and the educated. So it hits the most underserved members of society the most.
You talked about some of the things that we're all facing regarding serious health problems, cancer. We talk about Alzheimer's, these catastrophic events. A lot of times people don't really put diabetes way up there. What are the health ramifications of diabetes?
Well, diabetes increases risk of all common chronic diseases. So when you talk about Alzheimer's and cancer, the individuals living with diabetes suffer increased risk of those diseases as well, certainly of dementia, and it appears to be Alzheimer's. There's some people who consider Alzheimer's a kind of type 3 diabetes because there are mechanistic links to the same underlying problem that exists in type 2 diabetes, which is a condition that's technically called insulin resistance, and we can discuss that at length if you'd like.
Insulin resistance to the brain. You did mention just a moment ago about the number of people who have type 2 diabetes but are undiagnosed. What are some symptoms that people need to be looking out for, and what do they need to do if they have some of these symptoms?
Well, the obvious one is if you're gaining weight. So, and gaining weight, particularly around, the belly, around the waist, if your blood sugar, when you go to the physician, I mean, they should be checking for this or should be doing blood sugar tests and if, depending on the level of health care, measuring a variable called hemoglobin A1C, which is diagnostic criteria for type 2 diabetes or either diabetes. And this gets into the issues that I discuss in my book at length. And it's not, I wish I could say it's an easy read, but it is by no means a breezy read. The two ways to think about how we have approached diabetes is, one is, once you're diagnosed, then you can go on medications and pills, and the insulin and the medications are getting better and better, and the pills are getting better and better. And we've been hearing about these wonder drugs, Wegovy and semaglutide, that work for obesity and diabetes. Or you can cut back on the foods that you can't metabolize because of this disease. So diabetes is fundamentally a disorder of carbohydrate intolerance, which means it's the carbohydrate content of the diet that triggers the physiological response and the symptoms. And if you don't eat those foods, you, for the most part, won't manifest those symptoms, and you won't progress from pre-diabetes to diabetes. So there are two different ways to deal with it. The way this was phrased to me best was by a physician in Montreal, who said when she meets with her patients, she says, I can give you pills or I can teach you how to eat.
And before insulin was developed, if you look back in the old medical journals, that's how they treated. That was the only way to treat people who had diabetes.
Well, and so what sets me apart from other people writing about this disorder, I started my career as an investigative journalist in science and health, and I slowly moved into nutrition and chronic disease, where there's some just terrible science out there. And one of the things you always want to know about any scientific subject is, why do we believe what we believe? And so as a journalist, I can go back into the history to understand the evidence base of our beliefs or our expert beliefs. And the further you go back, the more interesting the story becomes. And in this case, we didn't have any drug therapy for diabetes until 1921, when the University of Toronto researchers discover they isolate and purify this hormone insulin from the pancreas, and they find that if they inject it into the animals or humans, it lowers blood sugar. So until then, the only way this disease could be treated was by dietary interventions, the only meaningful way. And throughout the 19th century, what we would call the standard of care today was what they called the animal diet. And by they, I mean every leading diabetes authority in the United States and in the United Kingdom, in Europe, in Germany, Austria, France, Italy. They had a patient come in with diabetes. They would say, don't eat sugars, starches, grains, legumes. And from now on in, you're going to eat effectively fatty meat or fish and green leafy vegetables. Today we would call it, I mean, it was for a while, this was the Atkins diet, and then it became, now it's keto. But this approach to treating the disease worked, at least for type 2 diabetes. If the symptoms would go into remission, the patients would appear completely healthy, so long as they adhered to this diet. And the logic was, when you try to eat carbohydrates, they make you sick, so don't eat them. And you could be perfectly healthy in a diet without them. And once insulin came in, we had this drug therapy, and now it gets complicated. But the gist of it is, once you start giving people insulin, a drug that lowers blood sugar, you have to feed them carbohydrates to protect them from their blood sugar going too low, which can kill them.
Yeah.
So you create this disorder of low blood sugar, which in the 1920s and 30s was referred to as insulin overdose or insulin shock. And then you make them eat the foods that they can't eat to protect them from the drug you're giving them to keep them alive.
Interesting. I'm afraid we're going to have to take a quick break and be right back. We're going to talk more with Gary Taubes. The book is called Rethinking Diabetes. Stay with us. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We're continuing our discussion with Gary Taubes. The book is called Rethinking Diabetes. And right before the break, you were talking about some of the problems with the way we treat diabetes now with insulin and other medications, as opposed to treating it with diet. And can you elaborate a little bit more about, you know, a lot of people are like, what's wrong with what we're doing right now with insulin? Because that way diabetics can eat whatever they want. They can have soda, ice cream, anything.
Yeah, and clearly they do. And this was part of the story that revealed itself in the literature when I went back to do this historical investigation. Once they have insulin therapy, it's easiest for the physician and easiest for the patient to let the patient just eat whatever they want, and then they would cover it as the terminology with insulin. So they start off, and as soon as the drug is available, it's a very powerful drug. The most powerful drug they have other than morphine, and it can kill you. So the theory, the initial thinking was keep the diet pretty much what it always was, which was either no carbohydrates or what they call a semi-starvation diet, where you just eat only, half the food you want and you're hungry all the time. So keep the diet very well controlled and use the lowest dose of this drug as you can, because this drug could kill people. And then as they go on, they realize that, well, people don't want to avoid carbs, especially kids. And it's easier for them and it's easier for the doctors. And the kids are probably going to do this anyway, which is eat whatever they want. So the safest thing to do is give as much insulin as necessary and let the kids eat what they want. The problem is they have no idea what the long-term consequences are. So with type 1 diabetes, which is this acute disease of insulin deficiency, it struck adolescents and kids most commonly, and it killed very quickly. And so these patients had never stayed alive long enough to see the long-term consequences of living with this disease. But by the late 1920s and 30s, these consequences come crashing in, and they're awful. So now they're keeping these kids alive for 10, 15 years to die of heart disease or kidney failure, or to go blind from retinopathies, to get nerve damage and amputations. And it's tragic what's happening, because these are still young people. They're still in their 20s now when they're dying. And the community of diabetes experts assume that this is a long-term consequence of living with the disease, that they can't be prevented, or it's a problem with not using the insulin rigorously enough, rigidly adhering to a schedule of insulin use. But they never question the possibility that this is a long-term consequence, not just of the disease, but of the diets that they're letting these patients eat. And then the insulin therapy on top of that, because every drug therapy has long-term consequences. See, the benefit to side effect ratio changes the longer you're on the drug. The thinking from then on in is we'll just get better drugs. We still live with this thinking today. As we get better drugs, we assume, well, now we've solved it, and that these drugs don't solve it for everything. We'll keep solving. But what you see in the studies that are done in the 1980s and 1990s is the diabetes specialists concluding that these diseases, both type 1 and type 2, are what they call chronic progressive diseases, which means you have them for life and they're only going to get worse. And there's a study that I quote from 2018 from the American Diabetes Association, basically saying the biggest challenge to successful diabetes control is the resistance of physicians to keep adding new drugs or changing to new drugs or increasing doses. And this is all based on this assumption that you should tell the patients they could eat whatever they want, because they're either going to do it anyway, or nobody wants to be on a diet.
Right. And
the way I describe it in the book is it's sort of the drugs. So you get to eat all the foods your friends eat and your parents eat, your siblings eat, children, anything you want. I mean, ideally you avoid dessert sweets because everyone accepts that they're luxuries that can't be afforded. But then we give you the drugs, and the drugs don't make you healthy. They just slow down or delay your being unhealthy. So if you don't eat these foods, you can stay healthy. That's what it looks like from the clinical trials that have been done for the last 10 years. If you do eat them, you could slow your progression with drugs.
Yeah. You bring up a really good point, and it's really backed up by a lot of scientific evidence. We're going to take another break and be right back with Gary Taubes. The book is called Rethinking Diabetes. Stay with us. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We're talking with Gary Taubes. The book is called Rethinking Diabetes. And as I said, you make a great argument for changing treatment away from the drugs, away from the insulin, and focusing on diet instead. Talk about what that diet would consist of.
Well, and this is pretty simple and very controversial. Again, the symptoms of this disease and the chronic progression of this disease are triggered by the carbohydrate content of the diet. So by that, I mean sugars, grains, starches, so the breads, potatoes. You start talking like this, and one of the dangers is you start sounding like a diet doctor who's advocating that you should eat something like an Atkins diet or a keto diet or protein power or sugar busters or whatever you want to call it. And they're all pretty much the same, and they all say that you should abstain from these carbohydrate-rich foods because they make you sick. In the past 15 years, there have been more clinical trials done testing the effectiveness of these diets on virtually every chronic disease state you can imagine. There's even trials being done on Alzheimer's disease. And while the medical community has considered them fad diets for the past since the 1960s and considered them too hard to comply with, eventually, once research started being done, it turned out that these diets seem to have remarkable benefits, particularly in diabetes, because you're not eating the foods that are causing you to, in effect, manifest the diabetes. It's like having an allergy. If you don't eat the foods you're allergic to, you don't get the rashes or the gastrointestinal problems because you're just avoiding those foods. I'll tell a quick story to give you the sort of the inanity of the situation we're in today. So one of the people I interviewed for my book was a chef turned journalist who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when he was 36 years old, back around, I think it's 2017, 2018. And when you're diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, which is the acute, really dangerous form of the disorder, you're thrown into this world like any disease diagnosis. You're suddenly dumped, drenched in this world of being a patient, and you're given all this advice and what to do, and that his physician very carefully explains to him that this is a disorder of insulin deficiency, and he needs the insulin to metabolize, to use these carbohydrates for fuel effectively and safely. And so therefore he's going to eat the carbohydrates, and they're going to give him an insulin schedule, and they're going to work it out how to inject this drug. And he says to them, he's got no preconception. So wait, what you're telling me is carbohydrates are toxic to me now, and insulin is the antidote, and I should eat the toxin and take the antidote. Why can't I just not eat the toxin? And it's a laughable line, but it's a commonsensical approach to this problem. And so when you go back in time into the history, as I did, not only do you find that this was how the disease was treated successfully, without the drugs, again, hard to tell what the long-term complications were because we didn't have clinical trials to compare them. And then you find, as I said, that once we had drugs, the medical community focuses in on drug therapy as a solution. They convince themselves that nobody wants to eat in a way that will keep them healthy if that requires avoiding certain food groups or certain foods. And therefore, they're doing their patients a favor by advocating for drug therapy and really believing that a dietary approach is going to fail. And now we have more and more individuals who have done this anyway, and who we know it succeeds long
It does
term.
succeed. Yeah, I've actually interviewed people who were happy to go off their diabetes medication and develop a keto diet and are so happy they did and don't need the diabetes medications anymore. A lot of times these patients don't even know that that's an option. We're going to take one final break and be right back with Gary Taubes. The book is called Rethinking Diabetes.
Stay connected with CBN News all day across our platforms.
Welcome back. We're talking with Gary Taubes. The book is called Rethinking Diabetes. We could really go on and talk about this so much longer. Unfortunately, we don't have the time. How can folks find out more about you, and where can they get the book?
Well, the book, Amazon, everywhere books are sold. If you have local bookstores, it's always independent bookstores. It's always great to purchase from there. My website is garytaubes.com. I'm on Twitter. Although I wish I wasn't. And, I mean, this book, it's I wanted to explain. It's got the history. It's a dense read. It's if nothing else, try to get your physicians to read it.
Absolutely.
It's written for them. It's written for your diabetes educators and dietitians, so they will understand that it's incumbent on them to learn this dietary approach and help patients live with it, to pick it up, because they're doing everyone a favor.
Absolutely. Well, Gary, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you for all your research. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Laura.
And thanks to you for being with us for this edition of Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson, and we'll see you again next week.